Welcome to this week's Single Sales Principle webinar. Today we are focusing on the power of emotion, how we decide what to buy. You'll know that on SSP we talk a lot about people buying emotionally and justifying rationally, and the fact that often when we are in a fact-find situation identifying compelling needs, often there will be rational needs that the customer gives you. However, it's the emotional needs that are often driving that decision. It's not as easy as just turning off the emotion button. We're constantly being driven by our emotions, and that is sending signals to our brain in terms of what we think we are rationally making decisions on. Now, there are a couple of great books out there, and I really want to focus a little bit on each of these to really explore the emotional brain and the effect it is having on our decision making. One is How We Decide by Jonah Lehrer, and the other is by Dr. Steve Peters, which is The Chimp Paradox, the Mind Management. Let's take a quick look at Dr. Steve Peters, The Chimp Paradox. And I really love the way that he uses the chimp as this naughty emotional brain that is causing havoc with us. So he very much talks about three parts of our brain. There's the frontal lobe. This is where we're making logical decisions. There's the limbic brain, the emotional brain, where this chimp is running riot. And then the parietal brain. Now, the parietal brain is part of the brain that it's a bit like a computer hard drive. And it's where all of our knowledge and experiences are being stored. So effectively, the chimp is running around, not really knowing what to do. It's just purely acting on impulse. And then effectively, the hard brain, the hard disk, the parietal brain, is sending signals to us saying, okay, well, based on what's gone on before, this is how we should react. But depending on whether we look at that part of the brain or whether we look at the limbic brain, the chimp going crazy, will depend on which signal actually wins and gets to the frontal brain. And at this point, it's the part of the brain that makes the final decision. I think this book explains it really well, How We Decide. So rather than me tell you a little bit more about the book, why don't I get the author themselves to actually tell you.
What happens in your brain when you make a decision? How can you make better ones? From choosing a cereal to finding a flight path to safety, science writer Jonah Lehrer tackles decision-making small and large in his book, How We Decide.
And whenever you make a decision, there's this argument taking place inside your head. And sometimes the argument is between rational areas like the prefrontal cortex and between areas like the amygdala or nucleus accumbens, areas that generate these powerful emotions. And so the key in terms of making the right decision is figuring out how to reconcile this argument, which side you should listen to.
Neuroscience shows that successfully choosing a cereal might use the more emotional areas of the brain. But what about life and death decisions?
So there's also a tug-of-war, an emotional argument taking place when we have to make very stressful situations. It's hard to imagine a more stressful situation than being in a cockpit when you lose total engine power over New York City.
70.
This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds, so you've lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
The amygdala is automatically turned on, and so it starts pumping out these intense feelings of fear and anxiety. And what pilots train to do, and they train to do this in flight simulators, is how to keep a lid on those emotions, how to make sure those emotions don't get out of control until the fear doesn't turn into panic.
Bird strike, he lost all engine, he lost the thrust in the engines, he's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529, which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines, he said.
Got it.
What they practice is the ability to think through those feelings, and that requires the prefrontal cortex, this uniquely human brain area. And so in the case of Captain Sullenberger, what that allowed him to do was to take a deep breath, to realize his fear wasn't going to save him, that his fear wasn't useful. So instead what he had to do was look at his airspeed indicator, his altitude, look how far away the runway in Teterboro, New Jersey was, or whether or not he could return to LaGuardia, and realize that the best decision he could make at that moment was to land on the Hudson. So that was very much a rational decision. In many respects, the brain is like a Swiss Army knife. It's stuffed full of all these different tools, these different ways of thinking. We can rely on the amygdala or the nucleus accumbens or the prefrontal cortex. And by using metacognition, we can really tailor this thought process to the task at hand. So, in a sense, learning about how we think can allow us to think better.
So let's take a look at the three parts of the brain that is really affecting our decision making. There's the amygdala. This is the part of the brain which is trying to avoid pain. It's fight or flight. The nuclear accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is a part of the brain which is generating pleasurable feelings, the dopamines. They've done experiments with mice whereby they pump so much dopamine into the mice, they actually die. Do you know what? They die of happiness because they're so happy they can't be bothered to get up and eat or drink. And then lastly, the prefrontal cortex. This is rationalizing the feelings and emotions that are being delivered by the amygdala and the NACC. So they've done some experiments and really tested exactly how we are, if you like, fooled by the emotional brain. There was a wine tasting exercise whereby they had different prices of wine, some ranging from $5, others up to $90. They wired the individuals to an fMRI machine and effectively monitored how the logical brain was reacting to the different wines. And they fooled the people that took part in the exercise, with some wines being priced, the $5 wines being priced as the $45 wines, the $10 wines being priced as the $90 wines. And effectively, the more expensive the wines become, the more the logical brain became excited. They had better ratings on the actual fMRI machine. Why is this? It's because our emotional brain is getting excited by the cost. It's not the taste of the wine that got me excited, it was the price of the wine. Similarly, when we on SSP spoke about prices of toothpaste, we very much spoke about the 25p toothpaste. Not an awful lot of excitement there. In fact, it was almost distaste how cheap that toothpaste was. But then when we showed you a toothpaste for £11.49, there was a real audible gasp of excitement in the room. Wow, a toothpaste for £11.49. How can that be? And typically somebody will always put that toothpaste up and start reading the box because now there's pleasure being created. Wow, how can this be so good? What's in it? I really want to find out more. So our logical brain is being fooled by an emotional brain. They've done other tests whereby they've taken products like branded products versus unbranded products. So for example, people are given an aspirin, which is an unbranded box, and also given a branded aspirin. And they always say that the branded aspirin had the better effect than the unbranded aspirin, despite the fact they could be exactly the same product. They know in Coke tests, if you have a blind Coke test, you don't know what you're actually tasting. Most people can't tell the difference. In fact, often in blind tests, they even come up with the unbranded one tasting the better. However, when they see the brand, when they know it's actually Coca-Cola, most people will say, wow, the Coke is definitely tasting better than the unbranded cola. It's our emotional brain fooling our logical brain. Let's take a look at this a bit further. Let's imagine you were on a railway bridge and there was a train that had lost control and it was heading towards 5 workmen at the end of the line. An awful scene. However, you saw that there was a branch line going off to the right and there was one individual over at that side. And you could change the point, so you could divert the train from the direction it was in with the 5 people about to die, and it would be diverted over here with the 1 person. Would you change the points? Would you sacrifice 1 person's life for the sake of saving 5? Most people would say, as horrible a situation that this is, they would do that. They would hit the points and they would sacrifice 1 person. Another scenario, you're on the same railway bridge. The train is also out of control. But this time, instead of saving the 5 people by changing the points, you actually see that there's a very large gentleman to the left of you on the bridge. Now, bear with me with this. This gentleman is large enough that if you were to push them over the edge, they would actually stop the train. So you're going to sacrifice this person's life for the benefit of saving the 5 workmen. Would you do it? At this point, most people would say they couldn't bring themselves to do it. Why? Well, because you're effectively murdering this individual. It feels very different, doesn't it? Actually murdering that person as opposed to when you're diverting the train to the other. It's the emotional brain For some reason, even though the outcome is the same, we find it very difficult to comprehend the emotional side of murder. Another experiment that was conducted, whereby they were people going to a movie, and they would say, on the way to that movie, let's imagine that you bought a ticket in advance, and that ticket was worth £10. But on the way to the movie, you lost the ticket. How many of you would go to the movie, steal, and buy another ticket? The experiment conducted identified that only 46%, about half, of the people would buy another ticket. Okay, the other half wouldn't, because you know what? £20 to go to the movies is an awful lot of money to pay. The second scenario is whereby on the way to a movie, you lose £10. So you hadn't pre-bought the ticket. This time you simply lose £10. Would you still go to the movies and buy a ticket? The answer came back that 88% would still buy a ticket. So nearly everybody said, do you know what? Absolutely. I still buy a ticket. Now, how is this different from the first scenario? Well, the reason is because they didn't emotionally associate the loss of the ticket with the £10. Because effectively, I lost £10. That was bad luck, but I'm still going to the movies. Whereas replacing a ticket means the ticket is now worth £20. Do you understand? It's the emotional side. Logically, we both know it's the same thing. We both know it's £20. But emotionally, it's difficult to get over that. Okay? So there's this constant fight that is going on in our limbic brain. It's the amygdala, which is trying to save us from pain, and the NACC, the nucleus accumbens, which is trying to gain pleasure. And they've identified, again, by putting brain probes, that they can identify, depending on how much is activated and the messages that are going on. If the amygdala is activated more than the NACC, then the amygdala will win. Therefore, the signal that's sent to the brain is no, we don't want to do this because it will cause us pain. If the NACC is winning and it's being excited more than the amygdala, then the message to the brain says, do you know what? Let's go for this. So actually, our logical brain is making no decision whatsoever. It's all happening in our limbic brain. So what does this mean to us as salespeople? How can we use this information when we're trying to make a sale? Well, quite simply, we have two roles as salespeople. We need to excite the nucleus accumbens. We need to get those dopamine rushes going with the customer. They need to really want to buy our product. Through sizzle selling techniques, we need to get them really excited about the opportunity of implementing our solution. But of course, that comes at a price. So how do we limit the amygdala? How do we limit the pain on the customer? Well, that could be things like talking about the return on investment. That's still kind of the NACC though. What we really need to do is use value tools, and we speak a lot in the program about the various value tools that can be used. So for example, using various options, using scarcity, using decoys, using anchors and resetting the anchor. These are all ways that we can actually limit the amygdala. If you go into any department store, they'll normally have all the real high ticket prices at quite near the door. Why? Because they're trying to get us excited. But then what do they do to actually limit the amygdala? Well, first of all, they use credit cards. Let's be totally honest with ourselves. If you were paid in cash at the end of the week and the money was put into a brown envelope, would you spend half as much as what you actually spend at the weekend? I'm guessing you wouldn't. Why wouldn't you? Well, it's because when you part with hard cash, it hurts. If you take the family to a restaurant and you spend about 100 quid, that doesn't matter when you just, chip and pin. You can't see that money going out of your bank account. If you were to give £100 to the waiter or waitress, it would probably hurt a little bit more. Okay, maybe you wouldn't have that second glass of wine. So the whole point about credit cards and debit cards is that it makes it easier for us to pay because it doesn't hurt the amygdala. Again, they've actually proven that the amygdala hardly gets excited at all about paying with a credit card because we worried about that at the end of the month. The whole point about buy now, pay later. Why do big organizations do this? Well, because it doesn't hurt if I don't have to pay for it now. And the whole thing about sales, the fact that if you buy it today, it's 20% less than it was tomorrow, or less than it was yesterday, means that I get that real rush of, look how much money I'm saving, not how much money I'm spending. So in summary, your job as a salesperson is to excite the nucleus accumbens, get those dopamines rushing through the customer so that they're saying, yes, I want to buy. And then limit the amygdala by using the value tools. I can't stress enough, those value tools really need to ensure that the NAC wins, the amygdala loses, and then your prefrontal cortex makes a rational decision which says, yes, I'd like to go ahead with your proposal. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to speaking to you next time.